what do young professionals do so that they are able to build that judgment faster before becoming obsolete?
We need to make sure that current actuaries are learning enough of the basics.
So you worked with the US market, you worked in the Asian markets. How do you think that these industries are different?
But I think this is where the actuary mindset comes in. I actually regret that I'm old.
Hi Ron, welcome to the interview series Breaking the Pattern, where we talk to the leaders of actuarial industry to figure out what's going in their mind and help young professionals understand that actuarial science, which people think is a linear career graph, is not the same. It's not just about giving exams, picking a specialization and sticking to a role. It's much more versatile than that. So with that, I want to start with a very interesting and my personal favorite question. To people who don't know about actuarial science, how do you define what you do for a living?
Most of the time, I say that I use math and statistics to solve problems dealing with risk. I try to get them to understand that it's really not a mathematics career. It's really about solving business problems and that we tackle some really interesting and cool things. So, to me, I think anyone can pick up any topic from a newspaper or a podcast, and I can relate it somehow to the property casualty field, or I should say, I'll say property casualty field. Some places it might be called non-life or general insurance, but we mean the same by those topics.
I want to now, before we get into the technical aspect, take a step back to understand how you've come to the place you are, thinking about what kind of decisions you've taken. So I want to start with, from what I understood based on our research, is that actuarial science was not your only interest. While picking up your career, you had a lot of other interests that you were evaluating. So what were the other interests and how did it ultimately translate to a career in actuarial science?
Well, when I was in high school, I wasn't sure if I wanted to go into architecture, finance, mathematics, physics, and I think there was maybe one other topic, and I couldn't choose. So I kind of fell into it a little bit because my parents decided that if I went to the same school as my brother, that they would give us a car. And so they kind of were trying to steer me towards the University of Illinois. Now, the University of Illinois had a curriculum called Actuarial Science that I had a cousin who was doing something. She was actually going to be a life actuary, so I knew what an actuary was. But at the University of Illinois, you got first dibs in all math classes and all finance classes over math and finance majors if you were in the actuarial program. So my thought was, if it doesn't work, I could easily switch into one of those. But for me, it just seemed to fit like a glove.
Coming to the same, since you mentioned architecture particularly, I understand you have a very creative knack and you seem to be a person that is not just about technical knowledge. So where do you see that interest of actuarial science and the interest of creativity coming together? Because people think that this profession is very boring or very technical.
I have to say that I don't consider myself a very creative person at all, but I think I'm an inquiring person. Okay. I just want to know a lot of information, so I tend to ask a lot of questions. I think that's why when I was at the University of Illinois, the professor that I had, I think he saw that I just asked good questions, logical questions, maybe questions that might be obvious to some people but not others, that I was asking the right questions. So he kind of said, "Hey, Ron, I think you ought to consider being a property casualty actuary as compared to a life actuary." And I don't want to demean life actuaries at all. I have lots of friends who are life actuaries. But to me, it's more formulaic and maybe more simple. Where, what we do, one day we could be working on, motor, the next day simulating catastrophes. In one of the sessions I just came out of it, this conference, we were talking about robotics, we were talking about solar flares, we were talking about, maybe portable nuclear generators. And all of these risks to me are just so diverse and so cool and interesting. I actually regret that I'm old, because I think there's so many cool things for young actuaries to be dealing with in the future. And I just think it's, has a chance of being an amazing career. And I do think that, the Casualty Actuarial Society only focuses on property casualty risks. But I think the other societies that have a lot of life, health, retirement are thinking, hey, this is where the growth is going to come in.
I think reverse aging is something that's very in right now, and you look fairly young to me. So I would say that you are as old. Of course, you're a lot more experienced, but there's a lot of time, and the way that the industry is evolving, I'm sure you'll be solving a lot more problems. So I want to now extend a little bit further into how you mentioned about the curiosity that has helped your career. This is something that I picked up in one of the sessions that you took during the conference, where you talked about how actuaries usually stick to technical knowledge, but they need to have more collaboration. They need to engage with other people a lot more and come out with more comprehensive solution. So how do you think curiosity plays a role in the entire actuarial profession and this aspect?
Well, the word that I think of when you were talking was business acumen. So, if I'm looking at motor, I want to figure out how cars are changing. Things like autonomous driving, safety features. The other day, probably shouldn't say this on film, but I have a buddy who's crashing at my house while I'm away, and he was backing out of the garage and he hit a car. And it was because he no longer had my car's a little bit older than his.
Okay.
There was no camera for him to look at while he was backing up. And I think just simple things like that, how cars have evolved, really have an impact. And so we have to kind of understand those things. We're going to have flying cars and different types of things. So, even though I'm not working on flying cars, I'm thinking, what would I be thinking about if I was pricing these risks? And to me, it's just really interesting and unique. So, I read the newspaper a lot. I shouldn't say I read stuff online, which would show how old I am that I talk about newspapers. But I keep thinking of, how does this stuff affect the property casualty industry?
Right.
And so to me, I'm just inquisitive of how are we going to deal with these things? How are they going to advance? How it's going to affect everyday lives? And how are we going to insure them and protect people?
Fair point. Okay, so on this very topic, I want to ask the question that, since I believe that you are a very strong advocate of innovation and bringing new businesses into light, how much do you think insurance plays a role in this entire new startup era or the innovations that are happening at the scale that it is? How do you think actuaries play a role in it? And more importantly, how do you think insurance as an industry is evolving with the entire innovation that is happening in technology?
Well, it will get there. I think part of the issue with a lot of, say, like venture capitalists, and they come up with an idea, normal insurance products don't fit those well. And I think that there's a space for actuaries to get involved with some strange cutting edge issues. With venture capital, how much are you willing to lose? Do you need insurance, etc.? But I think sometimes investors might say, hey, I want to hedge my bets a little bit. So I think that with new technologies, I think that there ought to be somebody who's thinking of the risk. Take AI, for example. While we're building AI, somebody ought to be thinking how it could go wrong and how it could make a bad decision. Whether or not it's transporting a portable nuclear reactor. Well, you could say, well, I'm going to design this so that it'll never, fail, etc. But what happens if you're transporting it in a truck and it gets in an accident, something cracks, etc.? So, to me, I think that just risking what could go, considering what could go wrong is a great mindset to have. And even if we go back to the beginning of insurance, where ships were sailing across the ocean to try to find new lands, I mean, people were funding that, right? And saying, listen, I'll put my money at risk and, I want to hedge a little bit. So, I mean, I think that's how insurance started. And so with a lot of these new things, maybe when they're being designed, they're not really considering insurance. But once it starts going into production or the market, for example, flying cars, right? They were designing them. Maybe they're building smaller models. Now they're building large models. But as soon as you start letting these things fly, if they fall out of the sky, they're going to cause a loss. If somebody's in it and they get injured. So eventually you have to go kind of from concept to application. And I think that's where actuaries, risk managers, and people dealing with risk and insurance have really interesting opportunities.
Remember reading an article where there was a debate going on as to who would be liable if a person driving an autonomous car gets into an accident. Is it the car's fault or is it the driver's fault? So what is the take on that?
I'm not an expert in this, but I think it kind of goes from auto liability to product liability. And it will depend how much control I have in a car. If a car is fully autonomous, I'm doing nothing but just paying it for the ride. In that case, I don't control it. I don't decide which roads, how I'm going to brake, how I'm going to accelerate, how I'm going to turn corners, etc. So to me, that's a pure product liability. But it will be interesting if you end up buying this car and you own it personally versus, say, a corporation owning it and I'm just using it for short term. Maybe you're going a little bit back to a personal liability, but it'll really depend how much control you have in that vehicle that will determine whether or not it's personal liability or, say, a corporate liability.
So the next question is on the very same thing. I believe, and I'm sure we are seeing this around us, how ADAS as a technology is evolving and how cars are getting more and more autonomous and people have started relying on it. We have very less data on how to price it. In fact, all the other problems that we talked about, let's say transportation of a nuclear reactor or flying cars. Since insurance is such an important component of helping these companies innovate by hedging their risk, how do actuaries actually price for the risk which has no data?
I have to say that I think of a lot of things as in a frequency, a severity, what's the exposure, and then kind of what's the patterns. If somebody comes to me with something completely new, and I did some work on some product liability for some piping, we used to call it yellow brass. Oh. Well, I actually went to the engineers and started talking to them about the manufacturing process and how often it has a problem. And I tried to use some of that data. So in almost any product that we created, there's probably some failure analysis. So I would probably start with that. If it's something with flying cars, I think I'm going to, take aviation and match that a little bit with auto information and try to decide out of those two. But I think this is where the actuary mindset comes in, and maybe where we have an edge on AI. Is that we're going to ponder and consider the interplay, the interaction, how these things have worked. And, AI will probably get there some point in the future. Well, it will just, research everything and then try to figure it out. But I think right now, actuaries are still needed to kind of think outside the box. And AI may get there at some point. But, I think it's kind of the human aspect of thinking what could go wrong that right now I think is what helps actuaries stay relevant.
So since you mentioned AI, I want to take a step back, and before we get into the entire AI conversation, how do you think has the industry, the actuarial industry, has evolved over time from when you started to how you've seen the industry across various geographies and where you feel it is headed now when it comes to AI?
I've loved the actuarial profession because it's not stagnant. It's always changing. So, I mean, just to show how old I am, when I started my career, we did not have our own computers on our desk.
Oh
we
my
need
God.
to sign up for time
It's that old.
to run a query. So, I mean, we're going back 40 years almost. And, and then we had calculators. And if you were lucky, you had a calculator with a ribbon, right? So you could see what numbers you put in. But, then we had computers, we had Microsoft Excel, we had PowerPoint come in, and all these tools were like, wow, this is going to make your job so much easier. Do we need actuaries? Not PowerPoint as much, but, Microsoft Excel. People are like, oh, we're going to have these spreadsheets. We're going to need less actuaries. There was no economic capital calculations. There was no GLM. There was no CAP model. All of those have been, invented or designed during my career. Now, I have a problem with the word AI. I'm not quite sure where it begins and where it ends, right? I think it ends with AI destroys the world, right? The old
Sci-fi
movies from when
movies.
I was young. But, throughout my career, there's been an evolution of technology. And, I go back to the phrase big data and data analytics. Big data was something we were going to build in the future. But the next thing I know, companies are saying, oh, we've got big data, we've got frequency and severity. And I'm like, wait a second, we've always had that. And then there was data analytics, but, they were just doing simple calculations for analytics on say maybe, severity and frequency for body injuries and workers' comp. And I kind of feel the same with AI. Like, I think AI is something like artificial intelligence. But today, when people just talk about the advancement of technology, it seems to be in there. So I was sitting next to someone today, and he was talking about R and Python. And I don't think R and Python are AI, right?
Yeah, these are languages that has been here for such a long time.
Yes. So I think sometimes, like, AI is the current buzzword, and it gets used too often. But there is a lot of technological advance. Now, you don't have to know exactly how to code. You could speak to a device, and it'll actually do that code for you. And is that AI or not, right? Is it doing independent thinking? And I have to say, I'm not an expert in AI. But to me, I just think it's the evolution. Now, if you take a look at how technology has changed and how fast it's going, I mean, now it seems to be going straight up. Like, what can't we be able to do in the future?
Exponential curve.
Yes. So, to me, I struggle with what is AI. But I know that with more ability to analyze data and to use technology, we're going to do things in finer level of detail than we've ever done before. But, in the old days, we used to have pooling, which you'd have a lot of losses, a lot of risk. You'd think they're homogeneous, but it's, today I feel like we're analyzing things in finer segments, but ultimately, there's just a risk there that we are never going to be able to, to specifically say this guy who just woke up at 6 a.m. is going to get in a car accident going to work, right? But I do wonder whether or not with AI, whether or not we could reduce risk in the future by just understanding more of the, causations, maybe correlations, not quite sure what the right word would be. But maybe what we could use AI for in the future is to, figure out, for example, if we used all autonomous vehicles, would we have less accidents? And I think we would, right? It's kind of that unreliable human aspect of, hey, I'm going to fit in that small spot with my car. I'm going to go for it, and hopefully I'm going to make it. But I am amazed at AI and how younger people can do things so much faster than I do, which is why I kind of feel like I almost have to go to pasture. But the thing is that I think I've got the business sense and the inquisitive mind of asking the right questions and knowing what has gone wrong in the future. But I think actuaries need to embrace AI, run towards it, rather than say, oh, I don't want to use that technology.
What I get from your response is that AI is going to bring innovation at a much faster scale, because technology is going at an exponential curve. If it took X years to build the first calculator, then the Excel, it'll probably take X by 1,000 to build the next innovation because of AI. Now, my concern is for the people who are a little bit younger. So the biggest use case for actuarial mindset is going to apply context and judgment. That would come once they start working.
Yeah.
But AI, would it not create a barrier where before you end up in a position where you can apply judgment, the other work probably AI can do? So the question is, how does actuaries specifically to CAS or towards general insurance industry, what do young professionals do so that they are able to build that judgment faster before becoming obsolete?
Let's say you have a child and you could just give that child a calculator, or you're going to teach him basic math, right? You're going to teach him multiplication, division, etc. I think it's kind of the same way, that I think we need to make sure that current actuaries are learning enough of the basics to try to figure out if things go wrong. So in a presentation I gave on soft skills the other day, I talked about understanding the data, understanding the business that we're in. I talked about looking at diagnostics, and I talked about sensitivity testing. I think all of those things are really important and help build actuarial judgment. I don't think we're going to be able to cut those out and have successful actuaries. So we're still going to have to try to figure out how to have actuaries learn those. Now, you could sensitivity test much quicker today than you used to when I used to have to draw out a triangle on a pen with pen and paper, right? So you'll be able to learn sensitivity testing much quicker, but you kind of want things to sink in. I mean, when I give a presentation and I'm trying to get a point across, I try to say it 3 times, right? So that people will remember it. They say 3 times is the magic number. Well, I feel it's going to be the same way with learning business context and actuarial judgment, is you're going to have a little repetition of that before you can just get a young actuary straight out of school, give them some AI tool and say, develop a new product or something else. He's going to have some type of understanding. And I think that's a big question of how educators in the future are going to try to deal with that. But I think, understanding the data that you have, how good it is, when we talk about AI, it's all over the sales process, right? People know what I'm saying on my phone. If I say umbrella, probably later today, it's going to try to sell me an umbrella, right? I think there's just so much data and information, and then it tracks my sales, my credit cards, where I've been, what stores I'm going to. With the insurance industry, I don't think we always have very good data. Let's say you have some type of an umbrella claim. How much detail is in there about what caused the claim, what was the claim handling process, what were the issues? If you have an auto accident, there might be a little bit more information. So one of the things I think is that to really utilize AI, we might need to have more data, or there's still going to be a lot of actuarial judgment.
Nice insight.
And so I think that's part of the challenge is, the marketing side is going gangbusters with AI and innovation, but how far can we take insurance if we don't have a lot of this detailed information? But, who knows? Maybe a workers' compensation claim, your watch will tell you how hot you were, maybe whether or not you were getting drowsy, what's your blood pressure. And maybe it will be able to start warning us that, hey, this guy who's up on a railing pounding in nails might be at risk for falling.
So in academics, we already have kind of reached a stage where there are cameras available that tracks every student's facial recognition to understand whether or not the person is attentive in the class. Not just present, but attentive, how curious he is, all those things. That's already there in a classroom.
Okay.
It's only time when it comes to your wrist and your other like data points where it starts tracking all these things. But very interesting. So the fact that if there is less data, the requirement of judgment increases all the more and AI cannot come up. I want to, on a similar line, extend the question and say, how do you see various geographies behaving differently when it comes to the risk ability and the technology infrastructure that they are happy to adapt to? So you've worked with the US market, you've worked in the Asian markets. How do you think that these industries are different?
Well, I think in the US, even though we still complain that insurance data isn't that great, I think there's more data. Maybe it's a little bit better data. And so I think that more mature markets can advance quicker, right? But the following markets, the smaller markets here in Asia, get up to speed pretty quickly. In China, when I was working in Hong Kong, there wasn't a lot of data. Well, it took about 3 years for some of these companies to get enough data to be credible. And it's much less a litigious society. So, having a shorter period of data is sufficient. I mean, I think geography plays a role in what actuaries do. I think that actuaries in Asia tend to be, and I'll say this applies to life as well as GI or property casualty. I think that they're a little bit more knowledgeable about business operations, where if you have lots more data, you tend to be a little bit more technical. And geography definitely plays a part. And who knows, maybe, I keep hearing all these amazing things about Shenzhen and how you can order a drink with, they'll be delivered by a drone. And, maybe they're just getting tons and tons of data. So who knows, maybe they'll have a different type of data than we have in the US. I mean, in the US, we're always worried about privacy. And in China, I don't think that's as much as a concern, or you don't have a choice of what your privacy is. And maybe there will be different types of data, but there definitely are differences working in different regions. To me, I think that the liability system is liability system and state regulation is why we have so many property casualty actuaries in the US and not as many in Asia. And if you take a look in the US, I mean, last time I looked, there was probably maybe 2,500 property casualty insurance companies. I mean, I don't think we have that in all of Asia together, right?
Not even close.
There's definitely some differences, but who knows? Maybe the number of insurance companies will keep increasing. Maybe the governments will decide that bigger is better. We'll have to see. But there's definitely some, differences in regions regions and kind of regional data, regional regulation, which is important to actuaries going forward.
What do you think is the most exciting problem that is in front of you in this entire landscape of data and how the role of actuaries is evolving? Like, what is it? What is the next problem that you are really excited to look at?
I don't want to say that this is a recent phenomenon, but I think actuaries getting into other industries. I mean, we can talk about Frank Chang, who's a actuary that I think he might have gone from Fireman's Fund to Google, and he wrote him a letter and said, "Hey, I think you guys could use an actuary." Frank was like, "I can help you tackle problems where there's uncertainty and risk." And I think that mindset and that trajectory, I think, is just going to continue to grow over time, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be the insurance industry per se. It could just be the risk of, say, clinical trials, product liability. I think you can take a lot of those things in-house. And what I think people, there's certain risks that actuaries deal with, like property risk, liability risk, workers' comp. But there's a lot of companies that hire actuaries for captive insurance companies or self-insurance. And there's no reason why those actuaries couldn't jump into those companies, play those roles, help with, purchasing of insurance where the risk might be too much, and then start delving into broader uncertainty, whether or not taking a look at a new drug, how likely is a new drug to be successful, and if there are claims, what might they be? There's a point in my life where I was interested in building kind of models to predict kind of things that would go wrong with drugs. And I would look at, is it a beta blocker? Are they using, some type of enzymes from some other disease? And I was like, wow, we could build a huge database and try to predict this. Well, it didn't happen because data privacy, right? Nobody wanted to share their information on their drugs. But I think that those kind of issues actuaries could deal with. I just think there's so many new types of risks that we're going to be dealing with in the future. Robotics, someone was talking about, solar flare. As the world relies more upon electronics, if there's a huge solar flare that would wipe out electricity in a certain place, and I'm not sure if it has to do with the solar flare or some other type of emissions, I haven't studied this enough, but I'm starting to think about those risks and how it could affect the world. And, climate change is a new one that we're dealing with. I mentioned robotics. One of the topics that came up the other day was, portable nuclear reactors. I just think there's so many new types of things that we're thinking about that will really change the industry. And I'm excited that people will get a chance to work with these. But I'd like to see actuaries, get a foundation in what it is being an actuary and then moving into these other industries. I don't know that a young actuary who hasn't learned how to walk and run can immediately jump into some of those. I mean, I've met some that I think really can because of just the way they think. But I think others like myself had to build a foundation, and then from that foundation we could leap into other things. But the other thing I'm going to go with this is that I'm on a big pitch that actuaries need to do good. And, a lot of the senior folks I work with, and they say, hey, we don't want you to say that because it sounds like you're implying we aren't doing good now, right? We're making sure rates are reasonable, fair, not unfairly discriminatory. We're making sure that there's enough reserves and capital so that companies will be able to pay their claims. But I think actuaries need to up their game and address more societal issues. For example, what are we going to do about climate change? I mean, at this point, it's a runaway train in my mind. I think all these projections of, 1.5 degrees, we're going to try to keep temperatures. I mean, I think we're past that in a lot of places. I think it's going to, keep happening. I think we need to start thinking about what's going to happen 20 and 30 years ago or from now when nobody wants to insure risks along the coast, or there might be more weather variability and volatility. So I think we ought to be thinking more about the building stock, and we're stuck with what we have now, but going forward, how do we need to change things?
Having a long-term thinking.
Yeah, and another area I think actuaries should tackle is how do we get healthcare back under control?
It's a very big problem.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is care for somebody who's elderly. I had some friends within the last year have died, and one of them, towards the end of her life, it was a pretty crappy existence. And I don't think she wanted to be there, and I'm not sure the family wanted her to stick around under pain. But the doctors were like, we're going to try to save her. And when do we let people go? And maybe those decisions should be made with a little bit more humanity and also taking a look at the costs of these things. Now, I don't want to give people medicine based upon the costs and decide what they should or shouldn't get. But maybe we ought to just think about where do we best need to use the funds if we think medical care is out of control.
It's very interesting. I have two questions. One is, what can actuaries do to step out of insurance and go to bigger problems? I think one answer that I got is take initiative, write to the board that this is what I can bring to the table. But other than that, what can we as a society do to promote actuarial skill sets in industries beyond insurance?
I think part of it is that we need to make sure that we're not just teaching our actuaries to do rote calculations, etc. I think we need to try to create, more creativity in them by having them think through different types of problems, hypothetical problems. Hey, you're a man on the moon. This happens. What are you going to do? Like, put them in an environment that, hey, they're going to have to think about a lot of different things. So I think we could, have exercises for actuaries to go to. And I think, this is going to sound kind of funny. I think we need to make some actuaries bigger risk takers, right? Hey, I'm going to, take this risk with my career or try this for a couple years. And the other day, I came across an actuary in New York who wants to do more, kind of public work. He wants to work with the cities and trying to tackle some of its problems with an actuarial mindset. I mean, I am worried that a lot of U.S. cities and states might be getting into a little bit too much debt. But maybe having an actuary there kind of thinking of some of the long-term implications and how we're going to deal with these. And it's not actuaries alone. It's actuaries working with a team of people and trying to help define what the issues are and what the long-term implications are. I mean, in the U.S., Social Security, health insurance are some really massive issues that we're going to have to deal with. And, even looking at the future of AI on the workforce, I mean, do companies going to get that windfall, or should that windfall come back to society? If it's eliminating jobs and there's going to be future taxes on wages, maybe actuaries and economists and finance people need to get together and start thinking of some of these problems. But I do think actuaries can play a bigger role in climate, long-term issues, not necessarily how much we need to increase rates next year. I mean, I think that's very incremental. I think we ought to be tackling what's going to happen in 20 or 30 years when San Francisco gets flooded more often than it used to. Those are the kind of decisions we ought to be looking at.
I think one of the landmark judgments around AI is when China passed a law saying that the companies cannot remove an employee because they're replacing it with AI. I think we'll see those judgments more. One of the key things that I'm taking away is having that long-term thinking, specifically when you're looking at the problem, to help not just incremental improvements, but make a giant leap or be protected for the next generation to come. On the similar line, I'll come towards the later part of the conversation. From the student perspective, what are the key skills that you think at this point are the most relevant that students need to pick, young professionals need to pick to make a successful career, not necessarily in insurance space, but as an actuary?
I'm going to say curiosity, like just how things work and how things are affected. I think that, I think I mentioned the word business acumen. I think that they just need to think about the bigger implications and the bigger issues. And, even if it's something like territorial rating, well, territorial rating and maybe where people live have been decided upon or influenced by past decisions that we've made. I mean, in the U.S., you might hear terms like redlining or the fact that certain ethnic groups weren't able to get financing for mortgages, etc. Maybe we ought to just be thinking about some of those implications and where the government should be able to step in and say, hey, we don't want this to be a rating factor. And so, I think curiosity is a good thing. And I think that, don't just solve the problem at hand. Think beyond that problem to the next problem that it's going to cause. For example, okay, I'm going to make a plug. I read this book a while ago, and I really liked it. It was by Kathy O'Neill, Weapons of Math Destruction, not math destruction. And she kind of talks about the unintended consequences of mathematical formulas. And one of them is the high cost of colleges in the U.S., how much it has shot up. And she kind of correlates it with the implementation of formulas that said your university needs to have this, a newer building, etc. And I liked that book because it made me start to think more about the decisions I'm making. And, Kathy's doing things today with bias detection and fairness.
That is
amazing. And, she's kind of trying to, make sure actuaries are doing the right thing, or at least consider. I may not agree with everything that she's looking at or the way she wants to tackle it, but I love the fact that she's making us, question ourselves on the way we've done things in the past.
Questioning the fundamentals.
Yes, absolutely.
So the last question is, what are the top 5 things that you would look for in a candidate when he wants to join your team?
First, I'm going to say dedication. I want to know that they are committed to working hard and they're diligent, etc. I actually like that people are taking exams rather than just getting college credit. I know that might not be popular with certain actuarial societies, but I think it's, it's grit and determination. So that would be one thing that I would look at. Curiosity and asking questions. So in one of the job interviews I had, I've only changed jobs really once.
Yeah, I saw
career.
that. Was amazing.
And, today people move a lot. And then I eventually started my own small firm, but I only work when I find something really interesting these days. I'm mostly retired. But in my interview for my second job, I think it lasted about 2 hours. And I had known these guys through some mutual friends, and I was interviewing with them. And I just started asking them questions like, what do you do in this case? And, this really worries me about moving into consultant. And how would I know? And I think I just kept asking question after question. And I eventually stopped the interview and said, hey, you guys haven't been asking me any questions. Is there anything you would like to ask me? And they said, when could you start?
Oh my God.
And so I think that kind of like curiosity of thinking about how I'm going to handle things would be big as well. I think communication is important, that you can talk. When I started my career, I was a pretty shy person. You kind of had to really work on me to kind of, talk. Today's my favorite part of my job, right? Trying to inspire people, trying to question what people are doing. So I think communication is good. So let's see, I'd have to pick 2 more. I want somebody who's well-rounded. I don't want somebody who's just going to sit in front of a computer all day. I want somebody who's interacting, etc. And the last one I'm going to say is probably maybe not me, and that's family orientation.
Okay.
I think I want, I worry about society in the future, and I want to see families, and nothing against people like me that are single at my age, but I think they kind of build sometimes a happiness and a care for others. And I have a lot of care for others, but I think it gives you a different perspective sometimes. So those might be some of the initial things that I would look at. And the fact that when I need you to work late, you're willing to work late, because clients don't really care. When they have a problem or dealing with a critical issue, they want to know that you're going to help solve it for them.
Perfect. So I think now we know what you need to know to crack an interview with Ron. I think it has been amazing. I've absolutely loved interacting with you. Thank you so much for taking out time out of the entire conference. And I hope to interact with you a lot more.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So I love thinking about what actuaries are going to do next. So I'd love to be back on one of your podcasts.
Wonderful.